March 1945, Camp Atlanta, Nebraska. Klaus Fischer stepped off the transport truck expecting to find a starving, bombed-out wasteland, just like the propaganda films promised. Instead, endless flat fields, fat cattle grazing, neat white farmhouses standing untouched. Then a John Deere tractor rumbled toward them, and climbing down from the driver's seat wasn't a man. It was a woman, coveralls, red kerchief, shotgun slung over her shoulder. The German prisoners froze. One whispered in disbelief. A woman on a tractor? Everything they'd been told about weak, helpless America shattered in that single moment. But the real shock? She handed Klaus a hoe and expected him to work alongside her. This wasn't defeat. This was something far more dangerous. The beginning of seeing your enemy as human. If you want more untold stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about history, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Klaus Fischer had spent 18 months believing America was dying. The propaganda film showed breadlines stretching city blocks, children with hollow eyes, factories reduced to rubble by their own incompetence. The Reich's newsreels promised that any day now the weakened Americans would collapse under the weight of their mongrel society, their dependence on women and minorities to prop up a failing war machine. Klaus had watched those films in barracks across France and believed them because believing meant his side might still win, and winning meant going home. Now standing in the bed of an Army transport truck as it rumbled through eastern Nebraska in March 1945, Klaus felt the first cold fingers of doubt wrap around his certainty. The land rolled out flat and endless in every direction, unbroken by craters or burned scars. Farmhouses stood white and square against the horizon, paint fresh, roofs intact. Cattle grazed in fields so green they hurt to look at after months of gray European winter. Telephone poles marched in perfect lines alongside the road, wires humming with electricity that apparently still worked. No bombed-out cities, no starving crowds, no collapse. The other prisoners in the truck bed sat silent, faces pressed against the wooden slats, watching America refuse to match the reality they'd been promised. Someone muttered a prayer in Bavarian dialect. Another cursed softly. Klaus said nothing, but his hands gripped the truck's side rail hard enough that his knuckles went white beneath the grime. They lied, he thought. The Führer, the generals, the men in Berlin who sent us to die for lies. They all lied. The truck turned onto a dirt road that cut through fields of stubble left from last year's harvest. In the distance, a red barn rose against pale sky, and beside it a two-story farmhouse with green shutters and a wide front porch. The sign at the property entrance read Hartley Farm in hand-painted letters. The truck slowed, gears grinding, and rolled to a stop near a collection of outbuildings and equipment sheds. An American guard hopped down from the cab and barked orders in English Klaus barely understood. The prisoners climbed out stiffly, boots hitting Nebraska dirt for the first time. Klaus straightened his back and tried not to think about the last farm he'd seen, somewhere outside Dresden before the firestorms turned the whole world to ash and screaming. He pushed the memory down hard and focused on the present. A chicken scratched in the yard. A dog barked from somewhere behind the barn. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. Then he heard the tractor. The engine rumbled closer, a deep mechanical growl that Klaus recognized instantly as a John Deere Model B. He knew tractors the way some men knew scripture, had grown up maintaining his father's equipment on their Bavarian dairy farm. The sound pulled his attention toward the barn just as the green machine rounded the corner, trailing a disc harrow. Klaus expected to see the farmer, a man in overalls, probably middle-aged, weathered face under a cap. Instead, the driver who swung down from the tractor seat was a woman. She was maybe 35, lean and strong in the way people got from actual work rather than exercise. Dark blonde hair tucked under a faded red kerchief. Coveralls that had seen a dozen seasons. Work gloves stuffed in her back pocket, and a shotgun slung across her shoulder on a leather strap, casual as a handbag. The German prisoners stopped moving. Several froze mid-step. Klaus heard Otto Schneider, a former factory worker from Hamburg, whisper in disbelief. A woman? On a tractor? Driving a tractor? The woman walked toward them with the confident stride of someone on their own land, boots kicking up small clouds of dust. She stopped 10 feet away and looked them over with eyes that were neither kind nor cruel, just assessing, measuring, the way Klaus's father used to evaluate livestock at market. Where are the men? Klaus thought wildly. Where is her husband? Her sons? Why is she doing this alone? The American guard said something to her in rapid English. She nodded once, then stepped closer to the group of prisoners. Up close, Klaus could see the lines around her eyes, the grease stain on one sleeve, the calluses on her hands when she pulled off her gloves. Working hands. Farmer's hands. She looked directly at Klaus, and for a moment their eyes met. Hers were hazel, he noticed, tired but steady. She didn't look away first. Then she walked past him to a tool shed, opened the door, and began pulling out hoes, rakes, and shovels. She lined them up against the shed wall with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. When she finished, she turned back to the prisoners and spoke a single sentence in English that Klaus understood despite his limited vocabulary. The rows need turning by sundown. She pointed to the field, then to the tools, then back to the field. Klaus stepped forward before he could think better of it. She handed him a hoe without hesitation, the worn wooden handle smooth from years of use. Their fingers didn't touch, but Klaus felt the weight of the exchange anyway. An enemy soldier, a farmer's widow maybe, and a hoe passing between them like a treaty neither had signed. He took it and nodded once. She nodded back. The work started immediately. The rhythm of the hoe against Nebraska soil felt like memory made solid. Klaus worked the rows with the other prisoners, turning earth that was darker and richer than anything he'd known in Bavaria. The work was familiar enough that his body moved without thought, muscles remembering what his mind tried to forget. Spring planting. The eternal hope that this year's crop would be better than the last. For 3 hours, he almost felt like himself again, like a farmer instead of a prisoner, like a man who belonged to the land rather than to a war that had already lost. Then he heard the guards talking. They stood 20 yards away, smoking cigarettes and watching the prisoners work with the bored attention of men doing a job they'd done too many times before. Klaus's English was poor, but he'd learned to pick out words, to piece together meaning from context and tone. He caught fragments. Hartley, Dresden, 16 weeks. No word. Klaus's hoe stopped mid-swing. Dresden. The word dropped into his chest like a stone into dark water. He knew Dresden. He'd been there in February when the bombers came, wave after wave, turning night into day with fire that ate oxygen faster than lungs could pull it in. The city had become an oven. He'd helped pull bodies from collapsed shelters, bodies that crumbled to ash when touched. He'd watched the Elbe run black with debris and things he didn't let himself identify. 3 days of flames, and when it was over, Dresden was a word that meant the end of something that couldn't be named. Her husband, Klaus thought, and the realization came with a weight that made his knees weak. The woman with the tractor. Her husband was at Dresden, or near it, somewhere in that hell. He looked toward the farmhouse and saw her on the porch, hanging laundry on a line with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a ritual to keep chaos at bay. White sheets snapping in the wind. A woman alone on a farm that needed 3 men to run properly, and she'd handed him a hoe. Fed them lunch, treated them like workers instead of enemies. Klaus turned back to the soil and drove the hoe down harder than necessary. The other prisoners glanced at him but said nothing. They'd all learned that silence was safer than questions. That night, lying on his bunk in the prisoner barracks at Camp Atlanta, Klaus stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile 2 truths that couldn't both be real but were. The propaganda films that showed America weak and broken, and Maggie Hartley's face, dirt-streaked and unafraid, standing on her own land like she had no intention of breaking no matter what the war took from her. Who was he fighting for? Who was he becoming? Sleep came eventually, but it brought dreams of fire. Spring work began in earnest as April warmed the fields. Klaus and 5 other prisoners were assigned to the Hartley farm 3 days a week, transported in the morning and returned to camp at dusk. The routine became familiar. Maggie would be waiting, already hours into her own workday, and she'd distribute tasks with the economy of someone who'd learned to make every word count. Plow the South 40, mend the fence line, clean the equipment shed. The prisoners worked, and Maggie worked beside them or ahead of them, never asking them to do anything she wouldn't do first. Klaus noticed things: the way she woke before dawn, lamplight visible in the farmhouse windows when the truck arrived, the way she worked until dark, shoulders set against exhaustion, the way she left a water jug in the shade of the barn, and later, when the sun climbed high, a pitcher of cold lemonade with tin cups. She never made a show of it, just left it there like it was expected, like even enemy prisoners deserved something cold to drink when the Nebraska heat pressed down. He noticed Dorothy Hartley, too, the older woman who appeared sometimes on the porch, watching them work with eyes that held something harder than Maggie's careful neutrality. Dorothy's hands shook when she carried out sandwiches at midday, and Klaus understood without being told that she'd lost someone. Maybe more than one. The war had taken her sons, and now here were German soldiers eating bread in her yard. Klaus tried to make himself smaller when she was near, tried to deserve the mercy being offered even though he knew he didn't. One morning in late April, Klaus arrived to find Maggie standing beside the John Deere, hands on her hips, frustration written in every line of her body. The tractor sat silent, engine refusing to turn over. She'd already pulled the hood open, had already tried everything she knew, and Klaus could see from 20 feet away that she was fighting the urge to hit something. He hesitated. The rules were clear. Prisoners didn't initiate contact, didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't offer help that wasn't requested. But he knew tractors, knew them better than he knew most people, and watching her struggle alone felt worse than breaking a rule. Klaus walked closer, stopped at a respectful distance, said the only German word he thought she might understand. Entschuldigung. Maggie looked up, startled. Her face was red from exertion and maybe embarrassment, hair escaping from her kerchief in damp strands. She looked at him for a long moment, and Klaus saw her weighing options: trust or pride, need or safety. Then she stepped aside and gestured toward the engine. Klaus moved carefully, keeping his movements slow and visible. He leaned over the engine compartment and listened first, the way his father had taught him. Then he touched the carburetor, traced fuel lines, checked the distributor. He found the problem in under a minute: a loose connection, simple and fixable. He pointed to it, then made a turning motion with his hand. Maggie handed him a wrench without a word. Klaus worked in silence, tightening the connection, adjusting the fuel mixture. His hands moved with the confidence of old knowledge, and for a moment he forgot where he was. Forgot he was a prisoner. Just became a farmer, fixing a tractor on a spring morning because tractors broke and farmers fixed them. That's how the world worked, or used to work, before everything went wrong. He stepped back, nodded toward the driver's seat. Maggie climbed up and turned the key. The engine caught on the first try, rumbling to life with a sound that felt like victory. She sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, and Klaus saw her shoulders drop as tension released. When she climbed down, she looked at him directly. "Thank you," she said. Klaus nodded. Couldn't find English words, so he just nodded. But something shifted between them in that moment. Not friendship, not trust exactly, just recognition. Two people trying to survive by doing the work in front of them. Two people who understood that machines broke and crops needed planting, and the world kept turning whether the war was won or lost. May brought rain that turned the fields emerald and filled the air with the smell of growth. Klaus found himself looking forward to the days assigned to the Hartley farm, though he wouldn't have admitted it even to himself. The work was hard, but honest, and there was something healing in watching things grow instead of watching things burn. He and Maggie developed a language that required few words, just gestures and nods, a shared understanding built on the universal grammar of farming. She'd point to a fence that needed mending. He'd nod and gather tools. She'd indicate which field needed plowing next. He'd check the equipment and get started. It was a partnership born of necessity, but somewhere along the way it had become something else, something neither of them had names for. The other prisoners noticed. Otto Schneider teased Klaus in German during the truck rides back to camp, suggesting he'd found himself an American sweetheart. Klaus didn't respond, just stared out at the passing fields and tried not to think about how the teasing made him feel both defensive and guilty. There was nothing improper happening. Just work. Just two people trying to keep a farm running. But he knew how it looked, and more importantly, he knew how it felt. This careful trust they were building in the spaces between tasks. One afternoon in mid-May, the sky opened without warning. Klaus and Maggie were halfway across the south field when the rain came down in sheets, soaking them both in seconds. They ran for the nearest shelter, which happened to be the old barn on the property's far edge. Inside, they stood dripping on the dirt floor, breathing hard, watching water pour off the roof in silvery curtains. The barn smelled like old hay and motor oil and the particular mustiness of wood that had weathered 50 Nebraska winters. Maggie pulled off her kerchief and wrung it out, then used it to wipe rain from her face. Klaus stayed near the door, maintaining the careful distance they always kept. But Maggie sat down on a hay bale and pulled a cloth bundle from her overall pocket. Lunch, bread and cheese, and 2 apples. She unwrapped it, then looked at Klaus and gestured to the space beside her. He hesitated, then sat, leaving 2 feet of empty hay between them. She handed him half the bread and one of the apples without ceremony. They ate in silence while the rain drummed overhead and thunder rolled across the prairie like artillery, though Klaus tried not to make that comparison even in his own mind. When they finished eating, Klaus reached into his own pocket and pulled out something he'd been carrying for a week, waiting for the right moment or the right courage. A small wooden horse, barely 3 inches tall, carved during the long evenings at camp when his hands needed something to do besides shake. He'd carved it from a scrap of pine, using a pocket knife one of the guards had allowed him to keep after seeing his work. The horse was simple but detailed, head turned slightly as if listening to something in the distance. Klaus held it out to Maggie. "For you," he said in careful English. For kindness?" Maggie took the horse and turned it over in her hands, fingers tracing the carved mane and the delicate legs. She stared at it for a long moment, and Klaus saw something crack in her composure. Her eyes went bright with tears she didn't let fall. It had been months since anyone gave her anything, he realized. Months of giving and working and holding things together alone. This small wooden horse was the first gift she'd received since her husband disappeared into the war. She didn't say thank you, couldn't seem to find words. Just tucked the horse carefully into her pocket and nodded once, quick and sharp. Then she pulled out a creased photograph from her other pocket and held it toward him. Klaus took it carefully. The photo showed a man in army uniform, probably mid-30s, smiling at the camera with the easy confidence of someone who'd never imagined not coming home. He held a pitchfork in one hand and had his other arm around Maggie's shoulders. They stood in front of this same barn, younger versions of themselves, before the war made everything complicated. "Jim," Maggie said simply. Then, struggling with words she didn't know how to say, she pointed east. "Far. Prisoner. Like you." Klaus understood. Her husband was a POW somewhere in Europe, probably in Soviet hands if he'd been captured near Dresden. Klaus knew what those camps were like, had heard stories from Wehrmacht, soldiers who'd been held by the Russians before being transferred west, starvation, disease, guards who saw German prisoners as less than human, as payment for what Germany had done to their country. Klaus handed the photo back carefully. "Krieg," he said quietly. "War." Then, in halting English, "I not know if they live. My mother. Sister. Munich." Maggie looked at him, really looked at him, and Klaus saw the moment she understood that they were the same. Two people separated from everyone they loved. Two people waiting for news that might never come. Two people trying to survive by pretending hope was still possible. The rain slowed, then stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds in long golden shafts that lit the wet fields like a promise. They stood and walked back to work, but something had shifted. They weren't just farmer and prisoner anymore. They were two witnesses to each other's grief, Two people who decided that kindness in wartime wasn't betrayal. It was the only thing that made sense. Over the next weeks, Maggie taught Klaus English words during breaks: field, sky, corn, rain. He taught her German phrases, simple things about farming and weather. Dorothy watched from the farmhouse porch, her expression unreadable, but she didn't stop it. Maybe she understood that her daughter-in-law needed something to hold on to besides silence and worry. Maybe she just recognized that sometimes survival meant accepting help from unexpected places, even places that wore enemy uniforms and spoke in the language of the men who'd taken her sons. June arrived with heat that made the corn grow tall and turned the sky white by midday. The farm thrived under the combined labor, and Klaus felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war, something dangerous and fragile that might have been peace. He knew it couldn't last. Peace never did. But for a few weeks, he let himself pretend that farming in Nebraska was his life now, that the war was something that happened to other people in other places, that he might somehow deserve the small kindnesses Maggie offered without expecting anything in return. Then came the letter. Klaus was repairing fence posts on the north property line when he saw Maggie walking from the farmhouse toward the field, moving faster than usual. She held a piece of paper in one hand, and even from a distance Klaus could see that her other hand was pressed against her mouth. He set down his tools and walked toward her, forgetting protocol, forgetting everything except the desperate hope and terror written across her face. She stopped 10 feet away and just stood there, trembling. The letter shook in her hand. Klaus waited, giving her space, giving her time. Finally, she looked at him with eyes that were red and streaming. "He's alive," she said. "Jim. Alive." The words came out broken, caught between a sob and a laugh. The Red Cross had confirmed it. Jim's unit had been captured near Dresden. He was in a Soviet-controlled POW camp somewhere in occupied Germany, malnourished, sick, but alive. After 4 months of silence and imagining the worst, Maggie finally knew her husband was breathing somewhere in the world. She sank down right there in the dirt, still holding the letter, and wept with her whole body. Great shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep and dark, the place where she'd been storing her fear all these months. Klaus stood awkwardly, wanting to comfort her but knowing he couldn't. Knowing his presence was probably making everything harder. He was German. Jim was suffering in a German war, in camps built by German defeat, guarded by people who had every reason to hate men like Klaus. But then Maggie looked up at him and said something that made Klaus's chest tighten. "Thank you for fixing the tractor. Thank you for the fence posts. Thank you for being kind when you didn't have to be." Klaus understood what she wasn't saying, that her husband's survival and Klaus's humanity were connected somehow in her mind, that mercy given to one German prisoner was mercy sent into the universe on behalf of one American prisoner. That kindness was the only prayer that made sense when everything else had failed. That night, Klaus lay awake in his bunk and thought about the camps. He knew them, not the Soviet ones specifically, but he knew what happened when men were caged and starving, when guards saw prisoners as symbols instead of people. He thought about Jim Hartley, a man he'd never met, suffering somewhere because Klaus's side had started a war they couldn't win. And he thought about Maggie's face, torn between relief and new terror, knowing her husband was alive but not knowing if he'd stay that way. For the first time since his capture, Klaus prayed for someone other than himself. He prayed in the old Bavarian way his mother had taught him, simple words asking God to keep one American soldier breathing, to bring him home to the woman who needed him. Klaus didn't know if God listened to prayers from defeated soldiers who'd fought for the wrong side, but he prayed anyway because it was the only thing he could offer. The next morning, Sheriff Roy Brennan appeared at the farm during the work detail. Roy was a fixture in their routine, checking on the prisoner work assignments, making sure the Geneva Convention rules were followed, keeping the peace between nervous townspeople and enemy soldiers working their fields. But today he seemed different, more focused. He watched Klaus work for a long moment, then called him over. They stood by Roy's truck far enough from the other prisoners that their conversation stayed private. Roy pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and studied Klaus with the careful attention of a man trying to make a decision. "You're doing good work here," Roy said finally. "Mrs. Hartley tells me you fixed her tractor, mended half the fences on the property, haven't caused a lick of trouble." Klaus nodded, unsure where this was leading. Roy took a long drag on his cigarette. "I was in France in 1918. Got hit in the leg, couldn't walk, trapped in no man's land between the trenches. Thought I was dead for sure. Then a German medic found me. Could have shot me. Could have left me. Instead, he patched me up, gave me water, and told me to run." Klaus waited. Roy's eyes were distant, seeing something 27 years gone. "I let him go," Roy continued. "Didn't report his position. Figured mercy deserved mercy. For 27 years, I've wondered if that made me a good man or a bad soldier." He looked at Klaus directly then, and Klaus saw the weight Roy carried, the same weight every man who'd survived war carried. The knowledge that their choices had consequences that rippled outward in ways they'd never fully understand. "I'm telling you this because people in town are starting to talk," Roy said. "They see Mrs. Hartley treating you decent, and it makes them nervous. Some think she's being too soft, that you're taking advantage, that it's disrespectful to the boys who are still fighting." Klaus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd known this was coming, had felt it building in the way some of the other guards looked at him, in the silence that fell when the prison truck drove through town. He'd been fool enough to hope it might not matter. "I need you to be careful," Roy said, "for her sake as much as yours. There's a barn dance this weekend, Red Cross morale event. She asked if the work detail could attend, supervised, of course. I cleared it. But Klaus, you need to understand, people are watching. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and this all falls apart." Klaus nodded. He understood. Mercy was always conditional, always one mistake away from becoming something else. But he also understood that Maggie had asked for this, had thought enough of the men working her farm to want to offer them one evening of normal life. That meant something. That meant everything. The barn dance was held on a Saturday evening in early June in the community hall attached to the Lutheran church. Music came from a phonograph and 3 local musicians, fiddle and guitar and accordion, playing songs Klaus didn't know but could feel in his bones. American folk music, simple and bright, the kind of music that made feet want to move whether brains approved or not. The prisoners stood along the wall of the community hall, uncertain and out of place in their work clothes among the church dresses and Sunday shirts of the townspeople. Klaus watched American life unfold before him like a play he'd been told didn't exist. Neighbors laughing together, old men swapping stories, children running between the adults' legs, shrieking with joy that had nothing to do with war or victory, just the simple pleasure of being young on a summer evening. No bombs, no sirens, no fear etched into every face. This was what the propaganda films had promised was impossible, a society too weak and divided to function. And yet here it was, thriving in ways that made Klaus's throat tight with something he couldn't name. Maggie appeared beside him carrying 2 cups of punch. She handed him one without asking if he wanted it, the same way she left lemonade in the barn, like basic courtesy was just what decent people did, regardless of uniforms or flags. He took it carefully, aware that people were watching, aware that every gesture between them was being measured and judged. "You've earned this," she said quietly. "The work you've done, you've earned one evening of being treated like a person." Klaus wanted to tell her that he hadn't earned anything, that he'd fought for a regime that had tried to destroy everything good in the world. That kindness offered to him was kindness wasted. But he just nodded and drank the too sweet punch and let himself pretend for a moment that he was just a farmer at a community dance. Nothing more complicated than that. Then Leon Kowalski walked over, and Klaus's muscles tensed instinctively. Kowalski was in his late 60s, a Polish immigrant who farmed the property adjacent to the Hartley land. Klaus had seen him from a distance but never spoken to him, and he knew enough history to understand that a Polish man would have every reason to hate Germans. Poland had been crushed between 2 empires, carved up and occupied, its people treated as less than human by Klaus's own government. If anyone here had the right to spit in Klaus's face, it was Leon Kowalski. But Kowalski didn't spit. He stopped in front of Klaus, studied him with eyes that had seen too much history, then extended his hand. "My cousins fought on your side," Kowalski said in accented but clear English, "not because they believed in it, but because geography put them in Prussian territory when the war started. I know that sometimes the uniform you wear is just an accident of where you were born." He paused, hand still extended. "But you work honest here. Mrs. Hartley tells me you fixed her tractor, mended her fences, treated her with respect. That counts for something. That counts for a lot." Klaus stared at the offered hand, aware that everyone nearby had gone quiet, aware that this moment mattered in ways that went beyond just two men shaking hands. Then he reached out and clasped Kowalski's hand, and the older man's grip was firm and warm and held none of the hatred Klaus had expected. "In the old country," Kowalski said quietly, still holding Klaus's hand, "we had a saying, yesterday's enemy can be tomorrow's neighbor, but only if today we choose to see each other as human. You remember that, son. When you go home, you remember that." The music started up again, and the moment passed, but Klaus felt something shift inside him. He wasn't forgiven, couldn't be forgiven for what his side had done, but he was being seen, recognized as more than just a symbol of everything wrong with the world. And that recognition felt like water in a desert, like the first warm day after a brutal winter. The evening continued. Klaus talked with a local farmer about crop rotation techniques. He watched American children play games that looked almost identical to games he'd played in Bavaria. He ate potato salad and bread and felt almost normal for the first time in years. For one night, he wasn't a prisoner. He was just a man at a community gathering, and the simplicity of it made him want to weep. Then Eddie Marsh arrived, drunk and looking for a fight. Klaus saw him first, stumbling through the door with eyes already searching for a target. Eddie Marsh was 41, thick-shouldered from farm work and carrying grief like a weapon he needed to use before it destroyed him from the inside. His brother had died at Bastogne 6 months earlier, and everyone in town knew that Eddie had been drinking steadily ever since, trying to drown something that refused to die. Eddie's eyes found Klaus standing near Maggie, talking quietly about nothing important, just two people who'd worked together long enough to be comfortable in silence. And something in Eddie's face twisted with rage, so pure and simple that Klaus knew exactly what was about to happen. "You're laughing with a Nazi," Eddie said, voice loud enough to cut through the music. The hall went quiet. "While my brother's dead in Belgium, while Jim's rotting in some camp, you're standing here laughing with the enemy." Klaus stepped back instinctively, hands up and empty, trying to make himself smaller and less threatening. But Eddie was already moving forward, fists clenched, looking for someone to punish for a death that couldn't be undone. Maggie stepped between them, which was the worst thing she could have done because now Eddie's rage had a new target. "You're a traitor," Eddie spat. "Tom's dead, Jim's missing, and you're treating this Nazi like he's your friend. What's wrong with you?" The barn went silent. Klaus could feel every eye on them, could feel the judgment settling over Maggie like a physical weight. Someone in the crowd murmured agreement. Someone else said the word that would follow Maggie forever if this moment wasn't stopped. Collaborator. Roy Brennan appeared then, moving with the quiet authority of a man who'd broken up 100 fights before they started. He stepped between Eddie and Maggie, one hand on Eddie's chest, not pushing but just present. "That's enough," Roy said quietly. "Mrs. Hartley has done nothing but try to keep her farm running while her husband's a prisoner of war. These men work for her because she needs the help and because we assigned them there. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me and the county board." But the damage was done. The crowd was already pulling back from Maggie, creating distance that spoke louder than words. Klaus saw her face go white, saw her realize what this moment had cost her. Not just her reputation, but her place in the community she'd lived in her whole life. The price of treating an enemy, soldier, like a human being. Roy herded the prisoners toward the truck, the dance effectively over. As Klaus climbed into the truck bed, he looked back and saw Maggie standing alone in the road, small and still, holding herself together through sheer force of will. The wooden horse he'd carved for her was visible in her dress pocket, a tiny symbol of everything that had just been destroyed.